My father has always been a pragmatic man, more inclined to believe the evidence of science over fanciful tales. But there was one incident from his past that shook his staunch skepticism and left him pondering forces beyond our understanding. It happened about 15 years ago when I was still in high school. At the time, we lived in a small 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town. It was an older home, built in the 1950s when sprawling floor plans were in vogue. Our kitchen flowed directly into the living area, with only a bit of countertop providing separation. Beyond the cozy living room was a corridor leading back to the 3 bedrooms. On that fateful evening, my father was preparing dinner while my mother was in one of the back rooms folding laundry. I sat at the kitchen table doing homework as my father moved efficiently about the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a stir-fry. He had just stepped over to the stovetop to begin cooking the beef when some movement caught his eye. He glanced up and was startled to see a remarkably tall, thin figure dart across the living room toward the back hallway. My father is not a small man, yet he estimated this person to be at least 7 feet tall, possibly more. Their limbs were long and spindly, and they moved in a strange, jerky gait, covering the space in just a few strides. My father froze, unsure of what he had just witnessed. It was clearly a person, yet the proportions were all off, unnaturally elongated. Their head almost brushed the ceiling as they ran, hunched beneath the doorframe. More unsettling was the speed at which it moved, too quick for such an awkward frame. Unease trickled down my father's spine. Surely this was just a trick of the light, some illusion of shadow and dusk playing tricks on an idle mind. He glanced over at me to see if I had observed the figure, but I was hunched over my homework, oblivious. He considered the back rooms. My mother was back there folding laundry by herself, entirely vulnerable. What if that thing meant her harm? The thought spurred him into motion. Gripping a knife from the block on the counter, he hurried to the back hall, flicking on lights as he went. "Stay there," he warned me over his shoulder. I looked up bewildered as he disappeared down the corridor. My father checked each room, turning on lamps to illuminate every shadowy corner. But there was nothing. The rooms were empty, my mother alone and undisturbed. The only movement was the gentle billowing of the curtains over an open window. Relief washed over my father. Of course, there was no strange figure, just a trick of the light and his own imagination. He laughed at himself for getting so worked up over nothing. He returned to preparing dinner, shaking off the cobwebs of unease that still lingered in his mind. Later that evening, when I was getting ready for bed, I noticed my father seemed preoccupied. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He hesitated before nodding with a weak smile. "Yes, fine. Just my mind playing tricks on me." I let the matter drop as my father wasn't one to indulge in fanciful stories. But when I went to sleep that night, I found my own dreams filled with the image of that spindly figure darting across shadows. In the morning, some of my unease remained, like an icy splinter lodged beneath my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about that strange figure, even though it was surely just my father's imagination. At breakfast, I finally got up the nerve to ask him about it. "Dad, did you see someone last night? Or think you saw someone?" My father hesitated over his coffee mug before setting it down with a heavy sigh. "I thought I saw something, but it was just shadows. This old house plays tricks." I looked down at my cereal, stirring the contents aimlessly. "What did you think you saw?" He shook his head. "Nothing, just my mind fabricating things." I recognized the finality in his tone. The subject was closed, as far as he was concerned. We finished breakfast and I left for school with an uneasy feeling still there in my thoughts. Over the next week, I noticed my father took to checking the locks on the doors and windows several times before bed. He chalked it up to having been reading crime novels, but I wondered if it was from something deeper. Though he never spoke of that strange figure again, it seemed to have unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It was about a week later when the next incident took place. Once again, my father was in the kitchen preparing our evening meal. He was alone this time. My mother was out running errands while I was at an after-school club. It was a little before dusk, the living room still washed in waning natural light. My father diced peppers with rhythmic chops of the knife, sweeping the tiny cubes into a frying pan. He paused to wash his hands, drying them on a dish towel. When he turned back to the counter, he froze, the towel slipping from his fingers. There, standing across the room by the back hallway, was the same impossibly tall figure watching him. My father's heart seized in his chest, the breath trapped in his lungs. Time itself seemed to slow, each tick of the wall clock thundering in the silence between them. The figure was motionless, observing him with eyes that held neither warmth nor intelligence. Its wiry limbs jutted at odd angles, as if not quite under the sway of gravity. Even standing still, it exuded an impression of unnatural quickness, a coiled tension waiting to unfurl. My father's eyes narrowed, uncertainty curdling into anger. He was not one to indulge in flights of irrational fear. Steeling his resolve, he straightened to his full height and met the gaze of the figure squarely. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, pleased that his voice did not tremble. The figure tilted its head, regarding him with detachment. After a moment, it seemed to unravel before his eyes, corners and lines blurring, dissolving away like mist under the sun. In a blink, it was gone. My father released a trembling breath. His rational mind scrambled for a foothold, an explanation, anything to reassert a sensible narrative. But for once, there were no easy answers. What he had seen, twice now, defied logic. He stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, thoughts spinning fruitlessly, searching for reason in something outside the bounds of reason. At last, he turned back to preparing dinner, moving through familiar motions in a daze. But from that day onward, he would tell us there are things beyond this world that we cannot explain or understand. The unknown will not align to our expectations. We can only keep an open mind. My father never saw the figure again after that day. We soon moved from that house, heeding an urge to have a fresh start somewhere new. But the memory lingered. My pragmatic father was irrevocably changed, his staunch skepticism eroded by forces beyond his reckoning. He would not again dismiss supernatural stories out of hand, because sometimes the impossible intrudes without warning into our safe, familiar lives, and we are left struggling to understand that which lies beyond the limits of our comprehension. My husband and I were living with my brother-in-law and his 2 teenagers when I was about 5 months pregnant. He had an elevated house on a large parcel of former hunting land, several miles down an old country road. My husband worked a typical 9-to-5 job while my brother-in-law was an offshore oil worker, gone for weeks at a time. When he was away, the kids stayed with their grandma who lived nearby. It was a spacious place, but it had always given me an uneasy vibe that I chalked up to pregnancy hormones. One afternoon when I was home alone taking a shower, I suddenly had the intense feeling of being watched. I poked my head out from behind the curtain, listening closely. The house was silent. Figuring it was just nerves, I shrugged it off and resumed my shower. A while later, I distinctly heard the back door slam shut. This startled me since that was the only door we never used because it exited onto a 6-foot-high, unstable wooden deck. I jumped out of the shower and threw on a robe, hurrying to the kitchen where I could see the door. It was still closed, locked from the inside just as I had left it. Unease prickled down my spine. I checked every room but found nothing amiss. When my husband got home, I told him what happened. He brushed it off, saying pregnant women tend to be jumpy. With the doors locked up, we went to bed for the night. Sometime in the early morning hours, I was startled awake by the bed covers violently flying off of me onto the floor. My husband yelled and flipped on all the lights, then began frantically searching the entire house. He threw open every closet and cabinet, gun in hand, as I watched, bewildered. When I demanded an explanation, he said he clearly heard heavy boots stomping through the hallway and an unfamiliar man's voice. But our search revealed nothing disturbed and all entries locked. The only footsteps were our own padding through the empty rooms. We wrote it off as nightmares, but deep down I knew something freaky was going on in that house. Things only got worse when my niece and nephew came to stay while their dad was offshore. Late one night, my 14-year-old niece crept into our bedroom, asking timidly if she could sleep with us. Before I could even answer, I noticed her 16-year-old brother curled up on the floor beside the bed too. When I asked why they were both camping out in our room at 2 a.m., they hesitated. Finally, my niece said that something in her bedroom laughs loudly in the night. Her brother added that's why they attempted to sleep in his room first, but the laughter had followed them. Then loud knocks started at his door, chasing them down the hall to us. My husband immediately scoured their rooms top to bottom, gun drawn just like before. Again, nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. But those terrified kids refused to sleep alone in their rooms after that night. A few weeks later, my husband heard a man chuckling loudly in my niece's bedroom while home alone one evening. He charged down the hall ready to confront the intruder, only to find the room empty as always. By then, we knew it was time to get out of that house. After we moved, the kids decided to just live at their grandma's full-time from then on. Something menacing lurked within those walls, and it had zeroed in on vulnerable targets like myself and the youths. In hindsight, there were other minor occurrences that should have raised red flags sooner. Routinely, I'd feel unseen eyes tracking me while folding laundry in my niece's bedroom, or I'd hear faint whispers from empty rooms while home alone. One night, my husband shook me awake, convinced a dark figure was standing at the foot of our bed. But when he leapt up to confront it, nothing was there. Friends tried to rationalize it when we opened up about the occurrences. Old house settling, overactive imaginations, hormone-induced night terrors. But neither of us could deny the palpable air of dread that consumed that home. Whatever malevolent presence inhabited it remained hidden in the shadows, playing twisted games with our minds and feeding off our fear. The heaviness in the air would become stifling without warning, like a violent storm rolling in despite clear skies. To this day, I'm grateful we escaped that place before I had to bring an innocent newborn home to that darkness. I often think of the terror in my young niece and nephew's eyes when they crawled into our bed those nights. No child should fear such evil dwelling within their own home. My brother-in-law still owns that house, having never experienced the disturbances we did. But he eventually conceded even the kids refused to live there again after we left. I can only pray whatever remains trapped there continues to lie dormant, rather than terrorizing another fragile family. For I know true evil does lurk in some forgotten corners of this world, hungry and waiting for its chance to surface once more. I was 20 years old and working the closing shift at a gas station in a nice suburb outside of Denver. It was the beginning of summer after my sophomore year of college, and I had taken this job to earn some extra cash over break. The gas station was located right off the highway, so we got a pretty steady stream of customers filling up on their way home from work or heading out for the evening. It was a franchise station, part of a larger regional chain, so everything was real corporate and standardized. I didn't mind the job too much. My shift was from 2 to 11, and I usually worked by myself. It could get a little spooky being there alone late at night, but nothing too crazy ever happened. The most action we saw was the occasional drunk customer stumbling through or a shoplifter trying to steal beer. But I was just a cashier, so I'd just notify my manager and let him handle it. The night in question was a typical Monday in June. It had been a hot day, mid-90s, so I was grateful for the air conditioning inside the station. Business was steady but not too busy. Just a handful of customers here and there grabbing drinks, snacks, or smokes as the evening went on. Around 9:30, it had slowed down a bit. I was idly scrolling through my phone when I heard the ding of the door opening. I glanced up to see a man entering the store. He looked to be in his mid-40s, average height and build, wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Nothing about him stood out in particular. He milled around browsing the aisles for a few minutes before grabbing a 12-pack of beer and bringing it to the counter. I gave him the standard customer greeting as I rang up his purchase. He was silent at first, just staring blankly back at me. Then he asked for a pack of Marlboro Reds as well. I retrieved them from the tobacco case and added them to his total. "That'll be $17.82, I said. As I gave him his change, he looked directly into my eyes and spoke in a flat, eerie tone. "Are you enjoying your last day on Earth?" I froze, completely shocked. The man just kept staring at me, his expression impossible to read. My mind raced, unsure how to respond. Was he threatening me? Or just some harmless weirdo trying to be edgy? After what seemed like an eternity, I stammered, what did you say?" He didn't reply, just maintained uncomfortable eye contact for a few more endless seconds. Finally, he grabbed his beer and cigarettes off the counter without saying a word. Still stunned, I watched as he turned calmly and walked out the door. the cheerful ding of the bell contrasting creepily with what had just happened. I stood there in disbelief, trying to process the bizarre encounter. Who was that guy? Was that supposed to be some kind of warning or prediction about me dying soon, or just the ramblings of a deranged man trying to scare me? My shift was supposed to end at 11, but there was no way I was staying there alone after that. I immediately called my manager and told him what went down. He agreed that was really disturbing and told me to lock up and head home early. The whole drive back to my apartment, I was on edge, constantly checking the rearview mirror, convinced I would see that man following me. By some miracle, I made it safely inside my place without incident. I triple-checked that the door was locked before sinking down against it, overwhelmed with relief but also uncertainty. I didn't end up dying that night, obviously, but I called out sick for the next couple of days, not ready to be back at that station alone. When I finally did return to work, I was jittery and hyper-vigilant, eyeing each male customer warily. A week went by without anything odd happening again. The stranger never returned. Eventually, I started to convince myself it had just been some random crazy person trying to mess with me. I didn't report him to the police since he hadn't directly threatened me. The whole thing became an unsettling memory that would occasionally, randomly, pop back into my mind and send a chill down my spine. About a month later, I was working a closing shift and had just finished mopping the aisles. As I wheeled the mop bucket back toward the storage closet, a customer walked in. I nearly dropped the mop in shock when I looked up. It was him, the man who had spoken those bone-chilling words to me weeks before. He strode directly towards the counter, once again avoiding eye contact. My heart raced as I debated whether to confront him about last time. But before I could say anything, he placed a 12-pack of Coors Light on the counter. "Pack of Reds," he muttered gruffly. I hesitantly grabbed the Marlboros, hands shaking. Screwing up my courage, I stammered, "Hey, do you remember me? From that night last month you—" He cut me off with a hostile glare. Then he grabbed his beer and cigarettes and turned abruptly for the exit. I called after him, demanding to know what he had meant by that disturbing remark about my last day on Earth. But the man ignored me, pushing out the door hastily without looking back. The electronic bell dinged almost mockingly as the door slammed shut behind him. I was even more shaken than after the first run-in. I immediately called my manager at home, not wanting to wait until the end of my shift. He said I could close up early again if I felt unsafe, but I decided to stick it out this time, not wanting this creep to control me. The rest of the night crawled by, the minutes feeling like hours. Closing time couldn't come soon enough. Right as I was locking the doors, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. 2 officers got out and approached me cautiously, asking if I was the one who had reported a suspicious customer. I nodded anxiously, telling them about my disturbing encounters with the man. The officers informed me that a woman had been found murdered earlier that night, not far from the gas station, and the description of the man who had spooked me matched the vague suspect details they had. My stomach did a flip as the implication set in. This man likely had been telling me it was my last day on Earth during our first run-in. I could very well have been his next victim if he had targeted me then, instead of that poor woman. The police took down my statement and said they would patrol the station more that night. They urged me to call 911 if the man came back, or if I noticed anything else strange. I drove home in a terrified daze, plagued by guilt that I hadn't reported the incident back when it first happened. Maybe then this woman would still be alive. Over the next couple weeks, there were no further sightings of the man, but I remained constantly on edge, working closing shifts, keeping one hand ready to hit the station's panic button if needed. Summer ended uneventfully, and I went back to college in the fall. I eventually quit the gas station job, no longer able to bear the anxiety of being there alone after dark. The police never made any arrests in that poor woman's murder. To this day, I still feel ill when I think back to the nonchalant way that man asked if I was enjoying my last day on Earth before taking an innocent life. His chilling words and intense stare are seared into my memory, a warning sign I wish desperately that I had heeded.